Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Ms. Caitlin Shetterly, who's the author of Made for You and Me, Going West, Going Broke, and Finding Home, and the best-selling Fault Lines, Stories of Divorce. Her work has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, Elle Magazine, Self, and on Oprah.com and Medium.com, as well as This American Life and other public radio shows. She lives with her family in Maine. Ms. Shetterly, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
This is a fascinating read. I want to say a word about how well written it is. It's like reading a novel because it's so vivid, and I can see the picturesque things in my mind that you talk about as you travel across this country and Europe investigating this book. But I also want to say how much I appreciate the footnotes. The footnotes enrich what you have to say journalistically, and I so prefer them to end notes because I don't have to flip back and forth across the pages to read what I want to read. So it's a great book. The book is called Modified: GMOs and the Threat to Our Food, Our Land, and Our Future. And you...
I'm so glad. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad you like the footnotes. We can only thank the novelist Junot Diaz for that, who writes these exhaustive footnotes in his book and books, and I've always loved them.
Well, if you don't read them, you miss out on a lot, too. Well, let's start at the beginning, which is when you recognized, because your 15-month-old son, at the time 15-month-old son, and yourself, developed an allergy to GMO corn, and there was splotchy skin, and his had red and painful splotches, and his nose ran like a faucet, and he was cranky and fitful and couldn't sleep, and he had runny bowel movements and breathing raspy at night and crying inconsolably as if his belly and head hurt all the time. Sounds pretty awful.
Yeah, so, I mean, for me, I was sick for about 4 years myself with, and my symptoms were really perplexing, and this preceded having my son. And they were autoimmune in nature. I had rashes and headaches and a constant head cold, exhaustion, and pain throughout my body. And I went to see every specialist who would possibly see me, and lots of theories were floated and lots of things were tried. And I had everything from brain scans to neurological tests to I tried antidepressants, I tried cortisone shots, I tried everything, and nothing seemed to work. I did a very long treatment with Lyme disease, the idea being that I might have chronic Lyme disease. And at the time, it was just like a bizarre. I felt like I'd fallen sort of down into the through the looking glass, and I didn't know what was wrong with me or how we were ever going to solve this. And then I met an immunologist who said, well, he thought he was seeing an uptick in these bucket illnesses that had all of these different kinds of symptoms, and that uptick, he believed, could be tied to GMOs. And he thought he had started to see them and witness them, especially in children, since the mid-'90s when GMOs were first officially on the market. Now, keep in mind, just as another footnote, that they had been in field trials for maybe 15 years or so before that. But so he suggested I take GMO corn out of my diet. Corn because it's the most ubiquitous thing. Of course, soy, he said, is also a problem, but it's not in everything quite the same way corn is. And he also said he wasn't quite sure, the immune system is a very sensitive thing, and he wasn't sure if it was the genetic insertions made into the corn that was making immune systems go haywire, that they couldn't the immune system didn't know how to react to the numerous proteins that are made when you insert the genes from one thing into something else, or if it was the pesticides that are actually bred into the corn, or if it was the pesticides that are used on the GMO crops. That's really the important point, and I will come back around to that. Mm-hmm. So he just suggested I take it out, and I did, and I got better. We began sourcing our food locally, organically, buying large portions of a cow with friends, all of our beans coming from Maine and being organically grown, dried beans that we would soak, vegetables, and buying almost no prepared food. and certainly nothing with corn in it. And I got better, and we all felt better. The entire family was better in so many different ways, and I think I talk about my husband as well. And so the question was why, and that was, I'm a pain in the neck of a person. I'm not an easy convert. I won't go proselytize about things easily, and I'm always skeptical. And I just wanted to know if this guy was a quack. Did this make any sense? So I went out there and I started asking questions, and I drove by myself actually across the Great Plains in our heartland, and I interviewed activists and farmers and scientists. And then I went to Europe and I hung out with beekeepers who are concerned about contamination from GMO pollen and pesticides in honey. And I traveled with them, and then I went to California and I interviewed 2 scientists and studied the proliferation of GMO, basically contamination of GMOs in Mexico into the land races of corn. The corn is an extremely important crop in Mexico, and Mexico signed the Cartagena Protocol, which basically said no GMOs are allowed to be grown in Mexico. However, our U.S.-grown corn was contaminating their corn in the Oaxacan highlands, and the question was why.
Well, I don't want to pass.
I studied all those.
Yeah, I don't want to pass up the point that that you had to make everything organic and can fresh vegetables because corn is in everything. I mean, there's organic dextrose, and there's vitamin C, and even the lining of paper coffee cups, and dish soap is made from corn. I mean, it's just amazing how ubiquitous corn is.
It's amazing. I write that it was our Waldo. It was popping up in everything. And, it was just, as a mother, my son had what seemed to be a food allergy or sensitivity. Our pediatrician had just thrown in corn as a sort of a last resort of things to eliminate and try again. And when I was, as a mother, trying to find corn and feed my child and give him things, I was like, Jesus, it's everywhere, but that was really hard.
Yeah. So when you went across the country, across the Midwest, across flyover country, and you met folks.
That's the first section of my book. It's called Flyover Country.
And one of the things that struck me was when you met these people who are doing biotech farming. First of all, they believe they're helping world hunger, but it's just amazing how little labor it takes because the machines and the chemicals do so much of the work.
I know, geez, how do I talk about this? There are so many angles, right? The disenfranchisement from our land is one angle to discuss, and how serious that is. I think not to us spiritually and our health, but yes, I mean, Zach Honeycutt is the farmer I spend a lot of time with in the beginning of the book, and he's this super handsome, really kind, nice farmer who grows GMO soy and corn and popcorn, which is non-GMO, out in the middle of our country, and I spent some time with him, and I liked him a lot. He was very honest with me, and he was friendly, and he is smart. And he is a perfect representation of these farmers because, they have been told something by the chemical and seed companies. They have been told what they should do. I think that it's been very hard for farmers because they feel like they are in the middle of this fight, and yet many of them, like Zach, are really just trying to do the best thing. So Zach, told me about how basically when he was 5 years old, he would go out into his daddy's field and he'd be cutting out sunflowers and cockleburs and nightshades, and that's before Roundup and all the herbicides, right, that go with the GMOs. And his kids don't have that same relationship to the land anymore. And there was something about that bothered him the more we talked about it, and he admitted that to me, and that his kids might not get any closer to the land than riding around in his sort of acclimatized tractor. And he doesn't have to do that much on the land anymore. The pro side for him is that he gets to spend more time with his family. When he was a young child, he never got to see his dad, during planting season. His dad worked so hard. It's still a hard job, but it's a different kind of hard job. It's a more corporate hard job. You're sitting in your tractor and overseeing the computer of the tractor. He doesn't even have to drive the tractor. The tractor drives itself.
Let's talk about how that area has been transformed since the Dust Bowl, because there was a time when there was crop rotation and the prairie grasses were abundant, and now it's just monocropping and everything's corn and soy.
I'm so glad you asked that question. So one of the things that really was so apparent to me, but I hadn't heard anybody else talk about, but it became extremely apparent to me when I was driving across that part of the country, is how poignant and prescient the Dust Bowl still is for the people who live out there and are farming that land. This is a very hard chapter in our American history, the Dust Bowl and the Depression happening at the same time. And people's farms were lost, their livelihood was lost, sometimes they lost their family, their lives, and it was an extremely desperate and hard period in this country for so many people. And you have to understand that the climate in that part of the country is that it is still, people like Zach, their grandparents may have gone through the Dust Bowl, or they saw their own parents go through it, and it's still a part of the history out there. So when the big seed companies came and promised, we have the thing for you, no pests will get these seeds, these will be drought resistant, you won't have to use as much water, you're not going to have to till this soil, none of the soil is going to fly away because you're not going to touch it anymore, you're just going to spray this chemical on it, and it's going to all be okay, and we're going to take care of you. Of course they believe that.
Yeah, and
of course they want to do it.
Yeah, and it should be noted that we haven't talked much about the big six yet, but the biotech companies pretty much have a monopoly on seed and the herbicides and the pesticides that go onto this land, some of which are very 2,4-D, for example, is very close to the formula for Agent Orange that we used in Vietnam. Is kind of scary when I start reading about the chemicals involved and how powerful the biotech companies are.
Yeah, it is scary. I mean, I got to tell you, when Zach started to tell me everything he uses on his crops, I got asked last night at a reading, what was one of the most surprising moments in my research, and I think that may have been one of them. I just had no idea. I didn't have any idea you'd use that many things, and I also didn't realize that it's actually nobody's job in this country to look at the synergistic effects of all those chemicals mixed together.
Mm-hmm. At some point, I remember there's been an uptick in herbicides and insecticides, like 527 million pounds get dumped on our agricultural sites now.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are staggering, and it's the promise of the GMO was that we were going to use less pesticides, and it's actually been exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, many of these pesticides are known to be endocrine disruptors and carcinogens.
Now that's frightening. But let's turn our attention to your honeybees, the pollinators, the bumblebees and the honeybees are really being affected a lot by this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the thing to talk about there, and the thing that makes the most sense to me, is I think we all saw those pictures of the bees, the millions of bees that were killed recently during the spraying for Zika. And one of the scientists I interviewed said to me, look, of course they can't tell you this product is safe. If it's designed to kill stuff, of course it's not safe. And we have to remember that. Like, all the other insects that were killed that aren't as sexy as bees, mm-hmm. for that Zika spraying, we are permanently changing the ecosystem. We are conducting a war. This is the thing. We are always at war with something. Mm-hmm. And why? And we have to understand that we are doing this on a massive scale with our agriculture. We are growing our food, and the way we are growing our food, we are actually damaging our own health and the health of the planet. And that is startling to me and upsetting. And the bees are a bellwether. They are a canary in the coal mine, as are the monarch butterflies. And it just, God, it's so depressing because there's so much evidence about the bees and the pesticides and the GMOs that carry their own pesticides inside them and their pollen, and the honey being contaminated now with glyphosate. It's all there, and yet still we're discussing whether or not, chemicals are hurting the bees. I mean, it's just like,
and there's a mysterious disappearance of whole colonies, and we don't even know what has happened to them.
Right, the colony collapse disorder, yes, which, and there's been a real uptick since the advent of GMO crops of a kind of seed dressing, a pesticide called a neonicotinoid, which the seeds are also soaked in, the GMO seeds, which many researchers have proven is affecting the bees. It disturbs the nerves of the bees and disorients them.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to get a little bit of the flavor of your trip to Europe, but before we do, let's talk a little bit about some of the scientists that you interviewed who are advocates for the biotech industry policing themselves, because I think that's another thing that's part of the issue here.
Yeah, so the industry is supposed to do its own testing. That's how it's worked out in this country. It's different in Europe for the most part. And one of the proponents of that, who I spoke with, a guy named Bruce Chassey, who was found in the New York Times last year by a reporter named Eric Lipton to have accepted, perks from Monsanto, at least, and some of the other biotech companies as well, and also money funneled to one of his research foundations. He goes out and talks about, the pros of GMOs, and so it's questionable whether or not he ethically should be doing so. He told me about how, 2 tractor trailer trucks would have to back up, is what he said, to the EPA or the FDA for each product, and they just don't have the staff to go through the research to look at it. And Shelley Pingree, the congresswoman from Maine, basically said the same thing to me. These are these regulatory silos, she said, and they have no connection, and there's defunding and staff cuts, and it's no one's job to check this stuff out, really. And, we should be living much more like the European precautionary principle, which is one scientist said we need to say halt until we know more, and we aren't. We have to prove, Shelley Pingree says this, she said, with drugs, we have to prove that on every single mouse in the world, it's safe. With chemicals and pesticides, we have to prove that you're going to fall down tomorrow with cancer to make them stop using it.
Yeah.
So we're not even looking at this stuff before we get it.
Europe and Mexico are more anti-GMO than the U.S., but some states have tried to pass laws labeling the food, and the Big Six throw in millions of dollars to counter that. And, of course, the DARK Act should be mentioned, too. What they call the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act is better known to my political activists as Deny Americans the Right to Know Act.
Right, exactly. So that's the compromise bill that was passed, and basically what's happened now with that bill is that it denies the states' rights to label GMOs themselves, to have their own labeling laws, and it also basically says that you need to have a smartphone to find out if a food is a GMO. There's a very funny YouTube video of Gwyneth Paltrow as a mother and another mother going shopping at the grocery store and trying to, with their children, find the smartphone and then scan the package and make it work on their smartphone. There's some technical glitch and stuff. This is just an absurdity. Or you could call a 1-800 number apparently and find out if the thing you want to buy contains GMOs. The only thing I can say about that is that the only true non-GMO label, this is actually quite simple, is organic. Because something is non-GMO doesn't mean it hasn't been saturated with pesticides.
Right.
So that has conveniently been left out of this argument, and not by mistake as far as I'm concerned. The pesticides are the revelation of my book. I go on this journey, and as I say, even at the end of the book, who knows what really was wrong with me? Because when I changed my diet completely, all these things went. But the truth is that what we need to look at is what we're doing to the environment. As we modify the environment, we modify ourselves, and that's why the book is called Modified. It's just startling to me what we are doing, and I feel as strongly and passionately about what we're doing to the milkweed, to the monarchs, to the bees, to the birds, as I do about what we're doing to, your children or my children. And I don't like the idea that all of these innocents are the test cases for this.
Yes.
It makes me really uncomfortable.
Yes, and I remember at one point you said Americans are the sickest we've ever been, and it's kind of startling for a civilized nation to be that way at this point. But I do want to turn our attention briefly, at least, to the angels of agriculture in Europe, because you spent a lot of time with looking into honey in Europe, in particular. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so honey is such an interesting, and bees, such an interesting subject, and I think we're all, like, bees have become sort of this bellwether for ways that we're all feeling scared, right? The colony collapse disorder and what's happening to the bees is this thing that we're all fascinated by because we're, I think, ultimately worried about our own extinction, and the bees, of course, pollinate most of the food we eat. So I hung out with beekeepers whose honey had been contaminated with GMO pollen and who were concerned about pesticides contaminating their honey. And I just kind of followed them around and talked to them and through them looked at the European labeling system and the European system of GMOs and how GMOs work in Europe. And I look at the issues of colony collapse disorder as well as, this sort of bizarre situation we're in where honey is this, like, iconic, beautiful, pure substance, right? This thing that we just think of as almost the most pure thing in the world, and it probably the first sweet humans ever tasted, and yet it's been contaminated. And, I like to have honey every morning in my green tea, and yet should I be? Am I poisoning myself? I'm actually scared having honey, but I also really want honey. And do the medicinal benefits of honey outweigh the dangers right now? I don't have any ready-made answers for these questions, but I think that honey is a perfect example of what we're doing to our hive. Yeah. Our planet.
It was interesting when you talked about it as early as 7,000 BC. It was a food group in parts of Europe, and the Europeans, to their credit, are trying to keep GMOs from becoming mainstreamed over there. But honey, in particular, is one of the elements that they want to label, whether it's GMO or not. But there's an issue around that.
Yeah, so there are all these loopholes in the European laws. So when I was here, starting this book, everyone kept saying, well, it's so much better in Europe, and it was this grass is greener kind of thing. And it is better in Europe, but it's kind of just as confused in some ways, too, because of trade alliances. And Shelley Pingree, our congresswoman, talks about this in my book. But because of trade alliances, well, all of our GMO feed, and also that from South America, goes to Europe, and so the animals eat it. There's no labeling for milk, meat products, wine, honey. Those things are not labeled in Europe. And so there's this very interesting moment in my book where basically this guy who used to work in the food ministry of labeling in the agricultural ministry in Germany basically tells me we're in this pub, and I said, well, do all these people know that the sausages they're eating right now, were fed GMO feed? And he said, no, probably not. That was a loophole in the law, and that was achieved through lobbying. So it's very complicated there too.
And yet the juggernauts, the Monsantos and the Dows and even Pepsi and Coke and even Morton Salt get involved in making sure that their biotech approach continues.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of money to be made, and if anything, the way we can see that better right now than any other time is this Monsanto-Bayer merge, right? So Monsanto, they make the seeds, they make the chemicals that go with the seeds, and now they are going to be making the medicines we might need if we get sick from those products. So they've they've got us covered.
They've got the bases covered. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
I think of that sometimes when I'm on the beaches in Mexico and they sell you a bronzer the first day and then they're back with stuff to heal your sunburned skin a few days later.
Yeah. That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's somebody in my book says, well, what would the American people say if, the secondhand smoke studies were done by the tobacco industry? I mean, this is not a new story. We know this story, and yet it's now become so huge, and it's to do with our food. And unlike smokers, that's the other thing. Smokers, get to choose. They are putting that in their body, but for the mother there's not one mother out there who doesn't want the best for her children. Mm-hmm. And yet she can't choose if her food is contaminated or not. There's something just shocking and really desperate about that.
There's a few people who are trying to write about this, and they're sort of squelched by the big six. But you mentioned some scientists whose careers were threatened, whose tenure was threatened, and even you, when you wrote the Elle magazine piece, were discredited to some extent. But this guy, Ignacio Garcia, was particularly interesting to me because he seemed to be on the right track, but there were lawsuits and his job was at risk just because he was researching what he was researching.
Yeah, Ignacio, so when I was writing about Ignacio, I really held his feet to the fire. I wanted to make sure every part of his story was true, and his story is shocking and really interesting. But yes, he went through a lot, and he was trying to prove that the land races of corn in the Oaxacan highlands had been contaminated, and he was trying to figure out why. And he was, attacked and had a sort of threatening / terrifying ride in the back of a black Suburban, and he came out to tell the story, so he's sort of a Job's messenger kind of guy.
Mm-hmm. Well, this book took you 5 years in the making, and
yes.
Where do we go from here?
I don't know how to answer that except to say that in 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring about the dangerous effects of the pesticide DDT and many other pesticides that we were using in our school playgrounds, our public parks, on the sides of streets, and in our homes. And at the time, in her wake, the modern environmental movement was begun.
Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't forget. We shouldn't forget she was dying of cancer during the time she was writing this, right?
And she was dying of cancer during the time she was writing, exactly, and suffering. And she worked so hard to bring this amazing book. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you read that today, you can turn to almost any page, and we're using a lot of the same chemicals that she was talking about. We had 54 years between then and now. And by the way, Silent Spring was published next Tuesday, the 27th. That's the anniversary of the publication, September 27th. And we had all that time to roll back, and instead we have increased our chemical production. We now have 85,000 chemicals circulating in the environment, 700 a year. Only 200 have ever been scrutinized by the EPA, and only 5 have ever been banned. This is a situation, she says, it's outside the biologic limit of our body's abilities to evolve as fast as we are making those chemicals. Mm-hmm. And we can't evolve that fast. Mm-hmm. We are pumping this stuff into the environment. We have to stop.
Yeah. I don't know how to stop a freight train moving this fast, but I think it's something that we all need to be more aware of, and the book Modified will help you better understand the issues. We've been talking with Caitlin Shetterly. The book is Modified: GMOs and the Threat to Our Food, Our Land, and Our Future. I remind our listeners that if you don't hear our regular broadcast during the week, you can catch up with us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.